Let's step quietly into the streets of 17th century Paris. It's just past sundown. The sky, once violet, has deepened into a charcoal gray, and with no streetlights humming overhead, the city prepares to vanish into darkness. You walk slowly on worn cobblestones, careful not to trip. A faint glimmer comes from the upper windows of tall timbered buildings, mostly candles flickering behind leaded glass. The street below remains cloaked in shadow, smelling faintly of smoke, damp stone, and the day's discarded kitchen scraps. Paris, the largest city in Europe at the time, was not yet the City of Light. It was, in fact, one of the darkest cities after dusk. In the late 1600s, the act of simply walking home at night was an exercise in caution and routine. Most Parisians carried their own form of light, a candle in a tin lantern, or for those with means, an oil lamp. But candles were not cheap. They were, in fact, considered a luxury by the working poor, used sparingly, with rituals that bordered on sacred. To burn one frivolously was a quiet sign of wealth. You're standing now in a narrow lane off the Rue Saint-Honoré, a once prominent road that wound through the city like a ribbon of noise and commerce during the day. But now, it's silent. The candle vendors have packed up their carts, the taverns are dimming, and somewhere, a government-appointed lamplighter begins his rounds. In 1667, under the rule of Louis XIV, Paris made its first official attempt to tame the night. The king's Minister of Police, Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, introduced a citywide initiative: public lanterns to be hung at regular intervals. They weren't gas lamps or electric bulbs. No, these were iron or wooden boxes suspended from ropes strung across the street, containing large wax candles, sometimes tallow for economy, meant to burn from dusk till at least 2 a.m., and they required tending. The job of lighting and maintaining these lanterns fell to the garde-feu, the city's fire watchmen and lamplighters. Most were poor men, often with military or criminal pasts, who climbed ladders nightly, candle lighter in one hand and snuffer in the other, trudging from corner to corner. Some carried horn-handled lanterns of their own. Others used long poles to reach the overhead fixtures, and if a lantern refused to light, they were expected to troubleshoot, often in the dark, often in the rain, and always in silence. You might be wondering, how effective was this early attempt at city lighting? Well, not very. Candles didn't burn brightly, and the winds of Paris, funneled through its crooked alleyways, had a habit of extinguishing them with a whisper. Lanterns needed constant relighting. On a stormy night, half might remain dark. And there were limits to how many could be maintained. Only the main thoroughfares were illuminated, leaving side streets in inky obscurity. The candles themselves were peculiar. While the wealthy might afford beeswax, smooth-burning, faintly sweet and golden in hue, most lanterns burned tallow candles. Tallow, rendered from animal fat, had a greasy consistency and produced a dull, sputtering light. Worse, it reeked. Imagine a faint mix of burnt bacon and singed wool drifting through a city already struggling with sanitation. Despite the smell and the unreliability, these lanterns marked the beginning of a quiet revolution. Public visibility. For the first time, the authorities could claim a kind of watchful eye over the city after dark. Darkness no longer provided complete cover for pickpockets, smugglers, or lovers. Ordinary citizens, too, began to move with more confidence between neighborhoods. That is, if they stayed to the lit streets. But most still hurried home early, locking doors behind them with heavy iron bolts. Let's pause a moment and follow one of the lamplighters. His name, as recorded in a pay register from 1682, was Mathieu Dubois. He worked in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine district, known for its furniture makers and tavern brawls. Dressed in rough woolen layers and boots with wooden soles, Mathieu carried a ladder balanced across his back like a yoke. At each lantern station, he'd hoist the ladder, climb carefully, and light the wick with a stub of wax tucked in a clay cup. Mathieu's nightly route spanned nearly 4 kilometers. He was paid by the week, though poorly, barely enough to afford meat more than twice a month. Still, he enjoyed the quiet of his job. No one bothered lamplighters. Most were ignored like scenery. Sometimes Mathieu reported seeing stray cats dart through the flickering cones of light, or lovers pressed into shadowed doorways, whispering under the hiss of the wind. In his journals, scribbled in poor phonetic French, he noted that he liked the feeling of being the only man awake. That quiet might sound romantic now, but the darkness was not merely an absence of light. It was an active danger. Footpads, petty thieves who lurked in the dark, often waited between lamplit zones to ambush passers-by. To walk alone after midnight was foolish, unless you knew the path and the shadows. And the city gates, at that time, were still closed at night. If you arrived too late, you had to wait outside the walls till dawn. This risk turned candles into something more than light sources. They were companions. Even inside the home, candles had a schedule. One might be lit during supper, another when reading prayers, and then snuffed as soon as the final spoonful of soup was taken. Poorer families sometimes used rush lights, strips of dried rush plant dipped in fat. More affordable, but even dimmer than tallow. Think now of a family in the Marais district, a cooper, his wife, and 2 sons, living in 2 cramped rooms above their workshop. Their evening would consist of setting out bowls of porridge, talking softly around the single lit candle, and then retreating to bed, while the flames still flickered. The father would blow it out just before the youngest fell asleep. Every hour of burn was accounted for. As the city grew, so did the demand for light, and so too did the innovations. Around 1715, Paris began experimenting with reflectors inside lanterns, metal plates polished to a dull shine, meant to direct more light downward. It helped a little. But as anyone who's walked through candlelight knows, it's not the brightness that matters. It's the presence. The way the flame bends with your breath. The way it softens the world into gold and shadow. By 1750, there were more than 5,500 lanterns strung across Paris. It was expensive, it was inefficient, and it still left most of the city in gloom. But it was the beginning of something. A city cautiously learning how to stay awake. And yet, one question lingers in the soft night air. Did these early lights truly change how people lived? Or just how they feared the dark? The city of Paris in the 18th century was not unlike a great machine, one powered not by steam or gears, but by rules, rituals, and very precise amounts of melted wax. As the sun slipped behind the horizon and the shadows deepened between buildings, a quieter kind of order began to unfold. Lanterns must be lit, wicks trimmed, candles counted. Light, in this pre-electric age, was not just illumination, it was a civic duty. You might imagine that lighting a few thousand lanterns each evening was a matter of simple labor. But it wasn't. It was paperwork, a lot of it. By the mid-1700s, the effort to keep Paris even modestly illuminated had spawned an entire department, the Bureau des Lanternes. Housed inside a nondescript office near the Place du Châtelet, this bureau employed clerks, inspectors, suppliers, and accountants, all devoted to one singular cause: ensuring that the city didn't trip over itself after sundown. The bureau was meticulous. Records from 1743 show that every lantern had a unique number. These numbers were cross-referenced with cleaning schedules, wick replacements, oil deliveries for lamps used in wealthier quarters, and maintenance logs. If lantern number 267 on the Rue de la Verrerie was not lit by dusk, a complaint could be filed. If the complaint was verified, a fine would be issued, sometimes to the lamplighter, sometimes to the lantern contractor, depending on whose turn it was to maintain that section. Yes, there were contractors. The lighting of Paris had become a privatized operation. Different sections of the city were bid upon like parcels of farmland. Whoever offered the lowest price, while promising to meet strict lighting requirements, was granted the right to operate and profit from that zone. These contracts lasted several years and often included clauses about minimum brightness, relighting during storms, and timely snow removal from lantern tops. It's a strange idea, isn't it, that there were men in wigs and velvet coats, sipping wine by candlelight, discussing the cost per inch of wick fibers and debating the optimal burn rate of beef tallow. But such were the necessities of a city trying to stretch its consciousness into the night. The light had to be consistent, if not bright, and it had to be there, even if no one quite noticed it, unless it failed. In one preserved report, an inspector named M. Jolivet details a week of surveillance during a rainy November in 1756. His notes are precise. Lanterns at Rue du Temple, Notice 83-104, dim to near uselessness by 10 o'clock. Wicks appear waterlogged, several unlit, one missing entirely, replacement advised, contractor warned. These records rarely mention humans, only numbers and materials. The people, lamplighters like Mathieu, residents glancing upward with relief as lanterns glowed overhead, are ghosts in the margins. But still, they're there. You can picture Jolivet in his tricorn hat, peering up at each suspended box of light, scribbling complaints into his ledger with fingers stiff from the cold. And what of the wax? Ah, the wax. It was the lifeblood of the system, and it did not come cheaply. France, with its vast estates and beekeeping traditions, could not produce enough beeswax to meet urban demands. So imports became routine. Wax came in by ship from Spain, Italy, and even the Ottoman Empire, taxed, inspected, and melted down into standard-issue government candles. Each candle had to meet specifications. Some were meant to last 4 hours, others just two. Candle molds, cast in tin or clay, were stamped with the royal insignia to ensure that the wax hadn't been adulterated. Because yes, there was fraud. Unscrupulous chandlers, candle makers, were known to mix beeswax with tallow or pitch, producing candles that smoked, sputtered, and died too soon. Such fraud was considered a crime against the city, not because it robbed citizens of luxury, but because it made the streets dangerous again. Dim light invited crime, disorder, and accidents, so chandlers could be fined, jailed, or in rare cases, publicly shamed. Their defective candles would be paraded through the streets, melted down in front of the town hall as a warning to others. But the truth is, even the best candles didn't last forever. Enter the relighters. Around 1730, the Bureau began to experiment with midnight patrols, teams tasked with moving through the city in the darkest hours, checking on extinguished lanterns and relighting them when necessary. These men were called the Surveillance de la Nuit, and they worked in pairs, often with guard dogs. One carried a relighting torch, the other carried the logbook. They walked slow routes, whispering to each other, their footsteps echoing faintly under the wooden beams of upper-level apartments that leaned out over the street. Relighting wasn't glamorous. It was dangerous and wet and lonely, but it kept the illusion alive that Paris never truly slept in darkness. These men, forgotten by history, were the fragile tendrils of order in a world still ruled by shadow. What's often forgotten is that these lanterns did more than light the street. They gave a rhythm to the night. Couriers could now deliver messages past dusk. Soldiers could patrol more effectively. Bakers who began work in the early hours found their walk to the ovens less treacherous. Even crime changed. Thieves became more strategic, more selective, avoiding areas with new lantern installations. And of course, Parisians adjusted their habits. Wealthier citizens began attending more late-night dinners. Theater performances were extended. Coffee houses, first introduced from the Ottoman world, stayed open until midnight or later. And all the while, the wax melted. The lanterns themselves evolved too. Early designs were wooden boxes with glass panes and iron frames, strung on ropes across streets. By the mid-18th century, innovations had added mirrored backplates to amplify light, ventilation holes to reduce smoke, and shutters to protect against wind. But they were still, at their core, simple candle boxes, tended to by a vast invisible network of men and boys. Curiously, even as lanterns multiplied, the stars disappeared. Parisians began to note that constellations, once visible from their windows, grew faint, not because of the glow itself, which was mild by modern standards, but because the smoke and soot from thousands of tiny flames had created a thin haze over the city. A side effect no one expected. To light Paris meant to slightly obscure the heavens. And this brings us to an even duller but strangely beautiful point: the cost of burning time. Lighting was expensive. It consumed labor, fuel, Metal, wood, and wax, all commodities that had to be paid for, stored, delivered, and replaced. In fact, by 1770, lighting made up nearly 8% of the city's annual civic budget. That's more than sanitation or bridge maintenance, more than water, more than policing. And yet, citizens still complained. A satirical pamphlet from 1772 mocks the lantern contractors for lighting only their pockets, claiming that most lanterns flicker with the enthusiasm of a drunk snail. There were petitions for brighter lights, for oil lamps, for innovations that wouldn't come for decades. Still, the wax was poured, the wicks were trimmed, and every evening thousands of candles were lit, not because it made Paris bright, but because it made the city feel a little less lost in its own darkness. But one wonders, did the light truly push back the night, or simply give it a frame to hide behind? By the time the 19th century arrived, the candles that once defined Parisian nightlife were beginning to flicker out, not because they failed in their task, but because something brighter and cheaper was on the horizon: gas. But before we rush ahead to innovation, let's linger a little longer in the candlelit world, on the cusp of its extinction. This is a moment of overlap, of quiet competition between old light and new flame. For decades, wax and wick would coexist uneasily with gas and glass, sharing the streets of Paris like awkward roommates. In 1701, Paris still depended on more than 8,000 candle lanterns, tended each night by over 300 lamplighters, their job now increasingly bureaucratized. Each one received a uniform, a small stipend, and was expected to sign in and out with municipal timekeepers. They were given training in wick maintenance and lantern cleaning. Some were even promoted to chief of section, overseeing teams of relighters with all the authority of a mid-level paper pusher in a very slow-moving army of light. Meanwhile, at the outskirts of the city, engineers were experimenting with coal gas. Early gas lamps, introduced from England, promised brighter, more consistent illumination. No melting, no trimming, no waxy stubs. Just a hiss, a glow, and a promise of permanence. The transition wasn't swift. Parisians were skeptical. Gas smelled strange. It hissed unnervingly. Early installations were prone to leaks, and nobody wanted their street to smell like a burnt match. And then there was tradition. Candlelight, however dim, had become a kind of urban poetry. People trusted it. A flickering wax flame felt like home. In the wealthy Faubourg Saint-Germain district, old families petitioned to keep their candle-lit lanterns, citing the emotional character of flame and the civilizing ritual of relighting. And for a while, they succeeded. Wax held out in certain quarters, long after gas lamps had been erected along the boulevards. But the economic argument was unrelenting. Gas burned longer, cleaner, and brighter, and it cost less. Much less. By the 1830s, the number of candle-lit lanterns had shrunk dramatically. The Bureau des Lanternes, once the mighty paper fortress of wax, had merged with newer lighting departments, gradually phasing out its forms, its inspection routes, and even its title. Candle makers across Paris began to shift business models. Some turned to making devotional candles for churches. Others transitioned to boutique lighting for salons and theaters. The mass production of street wax was no longer profitable. For the lamplighters, it was the end of a profession. Some were retrained as gas maintenance men. Others found jobs cleaning the interiors of gas lamps. Many simply vanished into other forms of quiet, anonymous labor: coal shoveling, bell ringing, stair sweeping. And yet, in private homes, candles endured. In the working-class neighborhoods of Belleville and Montmartre, candles still flickered beside beds, in kitchens, and on windowsills. Gas had not reached every home, and for many, candlelight remained the only light. In this way, wax retreated from the public square to the private corner, becoming more intimate, more symbolic. There's something oddly touching about this retreat. The same flame that once guided bakers to the ovens and watchmen through the alleys now sat beside a seamstress as she mended a shirt, or a child as they tried to read a primer before sleep. In this smaller setting, candlelight regained something it had lost in the bureaucratic glare of public duty: stillness. And even as the city modernized, the ghost of wax lingered. Writers like Balzac and Baudelaire continued to romanticize candlelight in their works, using it as a symbol of memory, of slow time. In 1870, during the siege of Paris, when gas supplies were cut and electricity didn't yet exist, the city returned, however briefly, to candles. The flame, always waiting in the wings, stepped forward once more. In the end, candles did not disappear. They merely changed roles, from necessity to luxury, from civic tool to personal ritual, from the machinery of city life to the quiet companion of thought, prayer, and sleep. Today, when you walk through Paris at night, you'll find the streets washed in a soft amber glow from electric street lamps. But if you look carefully through a cafe window or pause before a church altar, you'll still see them. Small flickers behind glass, dancing in a draught, echoing the labor of thousands of forgotten hands. Hands like Mathieu's, who climbed nightly in the cold to ignite a street no one would remember. Hands like Jolivet's, who documented lanterns like they were monuments. Hands that poured wax into molds, trimmed wicks to regulation length, relit flames in the rain. And as you picture this slow, flickering city, one lit not by wires but by wax, you might ask yourself one final question. What did we lose when we made the night so easy to see? Before buttons, the world of clothing was a place of strings, loops, belts, brooches, pins, and more often than not, the quiet daily frustration of needing someone else to help you get dressed. Imagine for a moment waking up in a medieval village. It's cold. The fire has gone out in the hearth. Your clothes hang from a wooden peg near the wall. Wool tunic, hose, under tunic, and perhaps, if you're fortunate, a simple overgown or cape. But nothing you're about to wear includes a zipper. Nothing has elastic. Nothing snaps neatly into place. Instead, everything must be tied, fastened with string, secured with a bone pin, layered, folded, cinched. Getting dressed is not just a daily task, it's a process. This was normal life for much of human history. In ancient Rome, a common man might wear a tunic tied at the waist with a simple cord. Women's garments were draped and pinned with fibulae, decorative brooches that sometimes doubled as deadly weapons. The Vikings, known for their practical dress, used loops, toggles, and leather straps to secure their woolen layers. Even the Chinese Han Dynasty, famed for their silk robes, relied on sashes and wrapped fabric more than any kind of fixed fastener. The button, in short, did not exist as we now know it. Well, technically, it did exist, but not in the way we use it. Buttons, small decorative objects made of shell, bone, metal, or wood, have been found in archaeological sites dating back over 5,000 years. Excavations in the Indus Valley, for instance, uncovered ornamental buttons made of curved shells, some with small holes for thread. But these early buttons were not functional closures. They were status symbols. Ornaments, they were sewn onto clothing, not to fasten it, but to show wealth or to mark identity. Think of them more as wearable currency than fasteners. It wasn't until the Middle Ages, around the 13th century, that the button took on its now familiar job, slipping through a hole to close fabric. And when it did, it changed everything. Europe in the 1200s was undergoing significant transformation. Cities were expanding, trade was increasing, new fabrics were being introduced from abroad, fine wools, linens, and imported silks. With these fabrics came new tailoring techniques. Clothes were no longer merely draped, they could be cut to fit the body. And with the rise of tight-fitting garments came the need for more precise fastening. Enter the buttonhole. Historians still debate the exact origin of the functional button and hole system, but by the late 13th century, it was appearing on garments in Germany and France. And it was revolutionary. For the first time, people could close clothing quickly, securely, and, importantly, symmetrically. No more sagging folds or hurried knots. A buttonhole offered control. Of course, early buttons weren't mass-produced. Each one had to be carved, cast, or sewn by hand. Wealthy nobles commissioned buttons made of ivory, silver, amber, or even gemstones. A 14th century inventory of Queen Joanna of Naples listed hundreds of gold buttons sewn onto a single gown. Each one a tiny masterpiece. But even among the common folk, simpler buttons made of horn, bone, or wood began to appear on tunics, sleeves, and cloaks. They may not have been flashy, but they worked. And more importantly, they began to shape how people dressed. Suddenly, fashion had verticality. Robes could be closed all the way from collar to hem. Sleeves could be cuffed. Collars could be snugged around the neck or left open. Buttons allowed for a kind of customization that had been impossible with pins and ties. Clothes no longer just covered the body. They began to sculpt it. You, as a 14th century merchant, could choose to button your doublet high and tight, signaling modesty and control, or leave it open at the collar in a slightly rakish gesture. A noblewoman might choose dozens of tiny buttons running down the back of her gown, each one requiring a servant's help to fasten. It was not just clothing, it was ceremony. Still, buttons were not yet democratic. They were a mark of prosperity. The poor continued to tie, pin, and fold their garments. Buttons, like mirrors or shoes, were a sign that someone belonged to a higher class or was aspiring to. This association would continue well into the 17th and 18th centuries. Interestingly, buttons also began to play a role in regulation. As European cities grew and sumptuary laws, rules about who could wear what, were passed, buttons became one of the items that were restricted. In Florence, for example, laws limited the number of decorative buttons on women's gowns. In England, buttons made of precious metals were taxed. To have too many buttons or too fine a set was to risk legal attention. This didn't stop people from trying. There are surviving garments from the 16th century with over 200 buttons sewn in a single column, many of them entirely non-functional. They weren't there to fasten anything. They were simply there to say, I can afford this. Meanwhile, tailors continued to innovate. Doublets, jackets, waistcoats, breeches, all began to depend on button closures. The human silhouette changed again. Instead of the loose, belted robes of earlier centuries, men's clothing became sharply structured. Women's bodices, too, embraced buttons, although often these were more decorative than practical. Lace and ribbon closures still dominated female fashion, especially in courtly settings. But the button had proven its worth. Fast forward to the late 1600s, and the button was no longer just a fastener. It was a language. Military uniforms began to use buttons to indicate rank, regiment, and region. The number of buttons, their spacing, their color, all were part of a visual code. Some soldiers wore brass buttons polished daily to a mirror shine. Others had hand-sewn cloth buttons meant to blend into the coat. Tailors even began to sew show buttons, completely non-functional buttons, added for balance, flair, or symbolism, on cuffs, on coat backs, on hats. It is around this time that the term buttoned up began to enter the language. To be buttoned up was to be tidy, proper, composed. The button had become a metaphor. But underneath all this social signaling, the button was still doing the same humble job it had started with, keeping clothing closed, holding sleeves shut against wind, keeping cloaks from flapping in the cold, ensuring, in quiet, everyday ways, that people could move freely through the world. Still, the story of the button is not one of instant success. It would take the invention of the industrial sewing machine centuries later, to make buttoned clothing widely affordable. And yet, by the 18th century, the world was already shaped by buttons, how people dressed, how they expressed status, and even how they told time. By the 1700s, buttons were used to fasten pocket watch chains to waistcoats. So now we're left with a curious thought. How did such a small object, no larger than a coin, come to reshape our sense of form, function, and identity? As the centuries ticked forward into the Age of Enlightenment and the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, the button went from being a handmade luxury to an everyday necessity. But it didn't lose its status entirely. In fact, it became more than a mere fastening. It became a unit of style, a quiet currency of appearance, and a subtle, universal language spoken through fabric. By the 18th century, a curious shift had taken place. Clothing, particularly for men, had become increasingly elaborate in its fastening systems. The ideal gentleman wore coats with rows of meticulously spaced buttons, often running from mid-chest to below the hips. Waistcoats, early vests, followed suit, frequently buttoned high up the chest, giving a snug, tailored appearance. Breeches, tight-fitting trousers that ended just below the knee, closed with small buttons hidden beneath flaps, sometimes referred to as fall fronts. The sheer number of buttons on a man's outfit could easily exceed 30. But most of these buttons served no real function. They weren't undone or redone each day. Instead, they were stitched permanently into place, acting as decoration. The real fastenings might be hooks, ties, or hidden buttons underneath. These were show buttons, placed purely for the performance of dignity. And what a performance it was! The Enlightenment period was an age of salons and discourse, of promenades and formal dinners where appearances were as much a statement of intellect as manners. To be buttoned was to be composed, correct, contained. The emerging idea of the well-dressed man was tied, almost literally, to how well his garments fit and how neatly his buttons aligned. Button makers, or boutonnières, became specialized artisans, and buttons themselves diversified rapidly. In London and Paris, entire guilds were formed to regulate button manufacture. Buttons made of silver, brass, glass, ceramic, silk thread, and even papier-mâché lined shelves and tailors' drawers. Some were etched with family crests or patriotic motifs. Others were painted with pastoral scenes, miniatures of lovers, or abstract patterns that mimicked the swirling grains of exotic woods. In France, under Louis XVI, buttons were sometimes the most valuable part of an ensemble. A courtier might wear a coat with buttons carved from mother of pearl or painted by hand with miniature portraits of the royal family. The buttons cost more than the coat itself, and as fashions changed, so did buttons. Wealthy families removed them from outdated garments and had them transferred to new ones. Buttons, like heirloom jewels, could pass between generations. But this extravagance had limits and eventually consequences. As revolutions swept Europe, first in America, then in France, the idea of what a button meant began to shift. In revolutionary France, ostentatious buttons became associated with monarchy and excess. During the Reign of Terror, wearing too fine a coat or one with too many decorative fasteners could draw suspicion. It's hard to believe that something as small as a button could become a political liability. But in those years, they did. The post-revolution period ushered in a new aesthetic, simpler, more practical, yet still deeply tied to buttons. The rise of the bourgeoisie, the growing middle class, brought a new button culture, one of neatness, precision, and economic modesty. Buttons were still everywhere, but now they were uniform, utilitarian, symmetrical. A black wool coat with plain black buttons became the symbol of good taste. Loud or unusual buttons became rare. Excess in any form was frowned upon. This trend accelerated with the Industrial Revolution. The invention of the button-making machine in the early 1800s changed the game entirely. Suddenly, buttons could be punched from metal, molded from porcelain, or stamped from gutta percha, a rubber-like material, in vast quantities. Prices plummeted. Where once only the rich could afford matched buttons, now even laborers could buy a coat with 3 neat rows of bone buttons. Factories sprang up in England, France, and the United States. The town of Birmingham became a button capital, exporting millions of fasteners annually. One 1850s catalogue lists over 600 styles of buttons, many organized not by material, but by the garments they were meant to adorn. Buttons for gentlemen's waistcoats, buttons for domestic servants, buttons for children's gowns, and so on. Buttons had become deeply integrated into the class system. Servants were issued uniforms with very specific closures, usually large flat buttons easy to fasten and less likely to come loose. Military uniforms were standardized with stamped brass buttons bearing regimental insignia. Even school children had their buttons regulated by code. But among all this industrial progress, one tradition remained: the careful matching of buttons to social aspiration. In Victorian England, button etiquette became almost an art. A gentleman was expected to leave the bottom button of his waistcoat undone, a quirk said to originate with King Edward VII, who, being portly, found it more comfortable that way. This style caught on and is still, even today, echoed in the unfastened bottom button of a modern suit jacket. Women's fashion during the Victorian era took a different path. Buttons were plentiful, certainly, but they were rarely functional. Gowns often featured long rows of buttons down the back, purely decorative. The real closures were hidden: snaps, hooks, or ties. This mirrored social expectations. Women were not expected to dress themselves. Their garments were designed with the assumption of assistance. Still, button design flourished. Victorian buttons were often embossed, engraved, or painted. Many were made from pressed glass or celluloid, imitating the look of jet, tortoiseshell, or ivory. A woman's button box, kept on a dressing table or near the sewing basket, might contain dozens of unused buttons, saved from old garments, meant for future repairs or hand-me-downs. Buttons had become not just fasteners, but keepsakes, souvenirs, tokens of domestic life. A button from a father's coat, a child's lost shoe, a soldier's uniform, all became tiny physical links to memory. But perhaps the most mundane and wonderful development of all was the buttonhole placket, that reinforced strip of fabric on a shirt or coat that kept the buttons aligned. It seems like a dull thing. But this small invention allowed shirts to be mass-produced with consistent sizing. It enabled people to dress themselves more quickly. It made buttons truly useful, truly ordinary. So now, in the hum of early factories, in the quiet click of machines stamping circles out of metal, the button had finally arrived at ubiquity. No longer a privilege, it was a tool, a habit, an expectation. And yet, one question hovered in the air between tailor and customer, factory and home. When buttons became invisible, did we start to forget how much they shaped us? By the dawn of the 20th century, the humble button had truly reached its peak, not just in popularity, but in integration. Buttons were everywhere, on coats, shirts, uniforms, boots, gloves, pillowcases, seat cushions. So commonplace were they that people stopped noticing them. They were no longer a sign of status, nor even of style, but simply of construction. And then, almost silently, the zipper arrived. Invented in the late 19th century and first marketed in the 1910s as a hookless fastener, the zipper was at first a curiosity. It was used primarily on boots, money pouches, and novelty items. But by the 1930s, zippers had crept into everyday life, first on men's trousers, then women's dresses, then on jackets, luggage, tents, children's clothes. The appeal was obvious: speed, simplicity, security. One tug, and everything was closed. Compared to buttons, zippers had no personality, no shape, no options for individuality. And yet, they signaled modernity. A person who wore a zippered garment was efficient, forward-thinking, perhaps even stylish in a minimalist way. But buttons didn't disappear. Instead, they retreated slightly from necessity into tradition, formality, and, strangely enough, fashion. Let's pause on that. Buttons, once utilitarian and silent, began to speak again. In men's fashion, a suit still required buttons on the jacket, the cuffs, the waistcoat if worn. Shirt buttons, ideally pearl or imitation pearl, were signs of quality. Even today, no tuxedo is considered complete without cufflinks, a direct descendant of the ornamental fasteners worn centuries earlier. Buttons, even when not strictly necessary, remained the mark of polish. In women's fashion, buttons became focal points. They were oversized, glittering, fabric-covered, metallic, wooden, plastic, sculptural. A single row of contrasting buttons down the front of a dress could define a look. And so designers began to play with the button's position, shape, even its visibility. Some garments featured faux buttons, decorative pieces with no function, a nod to history with none of the fiddling. In military uniforms, buttons continued to be meticulously maintained, polished to perfection, aligned with care, stitched to specification. Even today, cadets and officers in dozens of countries undergo button inspections. Not because the button is essential to fastening, but because it reflects attention, discipline, and pride. Yet buttons were not only symbols, they were personal. Ask someone to describe a childhood memory, and often a button appears. The coat they struggled to fasten with mittened hands, the button lost from Grandpa's cardigan and tucked into a drawer for safekeeping, the one-off button on a school uniform, mismatched and replaced in haste. Button boxes, those small tins or jars filled with saved fasteners, were once a staple of nearly every household. Buttons from discarded shirts, retired coats, broken toys, and repurposed pillows collected over time, forming little museums of domestic life. A mother might sit by the fire sewing one onto a child's cuff. A father might keep a spare in his wallet just in case. There's something strangely timeless about this act. Quiet, repetitive, almost meditative. Thread the needle, knot the end, position the button, stitch, loop, stitch, repeat. It's a rhythm, a legacy, passed down across generations. And it continues, even now, in an era of synthetic fabrics and adhesive closures, because buttons endure. Even fashion's avant-garde hasn't abandoned them. On modern runways, buttons are used to subvert, to decorate, to surprise. Enormous sculptural buttons on coats that close with zippers. Dozens of tiny buttons cascading across sheer fabric like beads. Buttons that button nothing at all, but instead invite a closer look. And in streetwear, buttons still rule the shirt. Zippers may own the jacket, but shirts are buttoned. Slowly, one at a time, morning after morning. It's a small act of order in a chaotic world. Then there's the digital shift. In the language of modern life, we press buttons every day on phones, keyboards, microwaves, elevators. But these buttons are metaphors more than physical objects. They no longer fasten, they no longer hold, they command. And yet, on clothing, real buttons persist. Their physicality matters. They anchor us. They are tactile in a world that is becoming less so. Think of the ritual. When you dress for an important moment, an interview, a wedding, a funeral, you likely fasten at least one button. That final act, slipping one side through the other, is a quiet signal that you are ready. Closed, gathered, composed. That sense of quiet control has ancient roots. Thousands of years ago, in the Indus Valley, someone carved a button out of shell, not because they needed to hold their clothes closed, but because they wanted to decorate their presence, to be seen, to say something without words. And so, here we are, thousands of years later, still fastening things with circles of plastic, wood, or metal. Still keeping boxes of spares. Still feeling somehow that something is incomplete if the button isn't quite done up. Maybe it's nostalgia, maybe it's habit, or maybe it's just that buttons, in all their simplicity, do something no other fastener can. They ask us to slow down, to align, to match one half of something with another, to take a moment, however brief, and make something whole.